C'est vraiment avec plaisir que je vois toutes ces personnes qui se sont réunies ce soir, un petit mardi soir, à l'Office de consultation publique. Et je suis très, très, très heureuse que ce soit une première soirée de partenariat avec le CRIEM de l'Université McGill. Très heureuse que le CRIEM ait fait la démarche de nous contacter pour qu'on trouve des façons de faire des partenariats ensemble, parce que nous sommes préoccupés par beaucoup d'enjeux qui sont les mêmes. Vous, plus d'un côté universitaire et théorique, nous, on est dans le concret, dans le pratique, dans tous les jours, on fait de la consultation publique. Alors, ce soir, c'est un lancement de livres et une table ronde qui est animée par le groupe de McGill. Et le livre et la table ronde touchent directement au cœur de ce que l'on pratique à tous les jours, notre métier ici à l'OCPM, à l'Office de consultation publique de Montréal. Et c'est la participation publique pour contribuer à la gouvernance de la ville. Donc, à l'Office, on pratique ça depuis 20 ans. Et c'est toujours très intéressant et très nourrissant pour nous d'entendre des gens qui réfléchissent à ça pour qu'on améliore évidemment nos façons de faire et nos pratiques. Alors, on est très content de vous entendre ce soir et de vous accueillir dans nos salles. Alors, l'OCPM, cette année, a fêté ses 20 ans. On est très fiers, on est bon, on sait ce qu'on fait, puis on va continuer. Mais ça a aussi mis en évidence les défis qui restent encore à relever. Tout n'est pas un grand champ de roses. Alors, à l'Office, après beaucoup de réflexions, on se rend compte que le fait que peu de mandats viennent à l'Office et qu'on ait toujours 4 mandats, 5 mandats de consultation par année, pose des questions. Alors, il y a certainement moyen de développer davantage de mandats, pas seulement en nombre, mais en institutionnalisant des pratiques. À l'Office, des fois, les gens ne savent pas, mais on sert au bon vouloir du prince, c'est-à-dire quand les élus décident de nous envoyer une consultation. Ce n'est pas un automatisme. Il y a très, très, très peu de cas où c'est un automatisme. Donc, quand on a célébré nos 20 ans, on a fait des colloques, on a fait des rencontres, on s'est rendu compte que c'était vraiment un de nos prochains défis de travailler avec la population à faire en sorte qu'une institution indépendante et neutre comme l'Office puisse servir davantage pour aider la décision publique. Ensuite, évidemment, on en parle depuis 20 ans. L'autre défi qu'il nous reste à relever, c'est le défi des suivis. Une fois que nous avons animé de grandes consultations citoyennes où de très nombreuses personnes ont participé, où nos équipes se sont attachées à faire de très bons rapports avec beaucoup de recommandations. Le suivi de ces recommandations-là et le suivi de ce qui est fait par les élus reste encore un projet, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'a pas de suivi pour le moment. Donc, c'est sûr que du travail comme vous le faites, et une table ronde comme on tient ce soir, ben ça fait partie des élans qui vont peut-être permettre de continuer à développer, donc à avancer dans ces deux défis-là, c'est-à-dire le nombre de consultations, l'institutionnalisation des consultations et les suivis des consultations. I did all my introduction in French. In French. I hope that that was okay for the people who speak English. And for the rest of the evening, people will speak the language that they are comfortable with, and we are almost all of us bilingual, so it's okay. So have a very good evening, and I would like to tell you that all the little buffet and the little drinks are available all night. So if you want to just go there and have some more, please do. We have plenty more in the kitchen. So enjoy the night with the conversation and a little bit of something to sustain you. Thanks.
Alors, est-ce que j'existe? Oui. Allô, bonsoir, merci, bonjour, bonsoir, merci d'être venu. Moi, je suis Nick Lucas. Je vais juste dire un petit mot. Je suis professeur en architecture et en urbanisme à l'Université McGill, mais je suis aussi le directeur associé du CRIEM. Vous voyez notre affiche ici. Le CRIEM, ça veut dire le Centre de recherche interdisciplinaire en études montréalaises, et on est vraiment ravis de pouvoir collaborer avec l'OCPM. C'est sûr qu'on a collaboré de manière ponctuelle c'est pas forcément systématique. Outre le fait que, via des collaborations avec des collègues comme Hoi, qui est le modérateur pour ce soir, des projets de recherche-action ont eu lieu. Et ça nous tient à cœur la coproduction avec les citoyens, les citoyennes, et l'avancement des connaissances sur comment est-ce qu'on peut améliorer les processus de coproduction. Donc, rapidement, la mission du CRIAM, qui est un centre de recherche interdisciplinaire, interfacultatif et interuniversitaire aussi, donc il y a 3 choses. Donc, bien que c'est basé à l'Université McGill, on a des membres qui sont affiliés aux universités montréalaises outre McGill. Et c'est vraiment un lieu de rencontre. Notre mission, c'est de vraiment stimuler et de fédérer des recherches en études montréalaises, ainsi que de stimuler des partenariats. Donc, ce soir, c'est un bel exemple de ce que nous poursuivons et ce que nous voulons poursuivre davantage à l'avenir. Sur ce, je vais sortir de la scène ici pour me mettre dans la salle avec vous autres et je vais laisser la parole à nos invités pour ce soir.
Good evening. My name is Tanya Monfort. I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University, where I teach law and society, and one of the co-editors of the book that we're launching tonight, Sustainability, Citizen Participation, and City Governance, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. And I won't speak very long this evening. I would really like to have as much time as we have here to have conversation. I did want to start us off, though, just discussing a little bit of what this book contributes, and then hope I can save the really juicy parts for you to buy at the end of the evening. I did want to start off with the opening quote that we started the book with, which comes from the social theorist Saskia Sassen, that says, "More than nation states, cities will be forced into the front lines by global warming, energy and water insecurity, and other environmental challenges." So really focusing on how cities are going to be where these problems are felt and where they're worked through. I was also going to start with another quote from one of our co-authors, Nick Luca, where he talks about cities and the problems with the climate emergency as being wicked problems that are very difficult to work through as they deal with kinds of participation and inclusion, which are really complicated in situations of climate emergency where we're dealing with problems of possibly sustainable development that doesn't necessarily mean a growth model anymore. Degrowth, is that possibly what we're talking about? Different people are conflicted in this. And so how do we work through that in an inclusive way? These are some of the very difficult problems that we're working through. The collection tackles some of these wicked problems that are associated with the climate emergency and environmental degradation and economic growth patterns or transformations that have to take place in order to avoid the worst consequences of the emergency. Now, one of the things that this collection does not do is it doesn't solve those problems, obviously. It's not even a coherent collection in terms of everybody agreeing on each of the things. One of the things that I think is actually what it brings to the table as having different visions, different political visions, different disciplinary visions, is that it provides actually something which is a much closer reflection of the ways in which cities are going to have to deal with the problem, which is through conflict, through the idea of conflicted visions and conflicted spaces. So 2 of the things that this collection actually does bring is, first of all, it unites the literature on social movements and innovation on the one hand, and law and collective action problems on the other. Now, these tend in literature to be separated, right? So governance having this kind of power from above looking down, and social movements as power going up. And it brings them together in a collection. And that's something which isn't always the case when you're dealing with urban sustainability collections. The second thing that it does is it creates a shared space of urban studies across Canada. Bringing down from what has been a hyper-focus in split across languages. So bringing in the Montreal and Quebec case studies, which tend to be more in French, into an English-speaking audience as well. So that the case studies and the lessons that people can draw from Montreal's experience can be translated out to the rest of Canada, which is not necessarily French-speaking, and vice versa. I can actually imagine this book being very useful not only for other people in Canada, but also for the rest of North America. The things of social movements that are really strong and part of a long history and tradition in Montreal are lessons that the New York audience would be very, very, very well advised to take into consideration as well. So ideologically, theoretically, it is a large tent collection that brings together pieces that break down the distinctions between things like smart cities, sustainable cities, and look inside the citizen-centric way of trying to channel some of these very difficult problems. And in this situation, we deal with some of the problems of participation and inclusion, some of the things that have been dealt with as collective action problems. In fact, collective action problems of kind of dealing with the city as a commons, where participation doesn't necessarily mean inclusion, ironically. And sometimes inclusion will actually negate participation in specific ways. So trying to figure out some of the lessons that have been drawn from Montreal, from British Columbia, from other spaces around Canada. And with that, I want to recommend that you take a look at the collection and open it up for a little bit of discussion tonight. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Thanks so much, Tanya. So I'm kind of feeling lonely up here. So, great, so thanks so much. Thanks so much for everybody for the lovely introductions. And for Tanya, thanks so much for the really great summary of the book, which is available on the University of Toronto Press website. I think it's also available on Amazon. So anyway, it's available. So I thought maybe we could start just by folks introducing themselves so that we can sort of, so I'm a professor in law at the University of British Columbia, and I also direct research access at CREM. For many years, I was a professor here, and what cities is one of the areas that I work within. So that's me.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Bonjour. That's the extent of my French. I apologize. My name is Amina Yassine. Originally from Toronto, so from the East Coast, but I live in Vancouver and work in Vancouver now. I'm an urban planner by background. And have recently moved into the role of Director of Planning and Public Hearing at Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue. I'll add more later.
Bonjour, hello, my name is Marie-Odile Melançon. I'm a Montrealer, lived all my life in Montreal, and I work for the City of Montreal. I've been working there for 20 years at the Cultural Department. Now I am Chief of the Division of, that's called Support for Cultural Development. And I work mainly on cultural neighborhoods, which is a big project we have.
Great. So I thought we could maybe start with a kind of launching off point from some of Tanya's words about the book, and sort of compare experiences between Montreal and Vancouver and places outside of Quebec around participatory processes. So maybe just some general reflections on participatory processes in Montreal, in the sector that you work within, Marie-Odile, and then maybe Tanya, you can just talk a little bit about. I'm sorry, you can talk a little bit about what's happening in Vancouver.
Yes, I'm not an urban planner, so I'm more of a cultural specialist. But cultural participation is very, very popular in Montreal. It's very present in all the neighborhoods. We use it a lot. We work through what we call cultural mediation, which is kind of an outreach approach, but a bit different, more of a French origin. And we organize projects with the people that are more vulnerable, that don't usually go to public consultations, and we do projects with them to make them engage in the city and to really participate in their neighborhood in very different ways. So that's what I would say, my part.
Great, and Amina, like I know that vulnerable populations are really a concern or a sort of a priority for the work that you're doing, both sort of with the city and with the WASC Center. So.
Yes, it is. So my foray into public engagement mostly began as an urban planner. So it's legislatively mandated to have public hearings within the urban planning process between first and second hearing. So that's under the Local Government Act. And so the work that I'm currently doing is looking at reform around specifically the public hearing process. However, before the public hearing process, what we do find is that there are very specific ways that each municipality has a lot of flexibility on how to approach public consultations leading up to the public hearing process, which is in the Local Government Act, just about a paragraph that speaks to how you can go about doing a public hearing, which is very limiting and pretty dry as well. It doesn't allow for the level of participatory engagement that we would want to see at a scale that actually speaks to the needs of vulnerable communities. So what the work that we're working on now, which is funded through CMHC, Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, is the housing supply challenge and how to reform the public hearing process in order to ensure that it is more inclusive. It is also more culturally competent as well. And what other mechanisms can be used that allow for the level of engagement within marginalized populations that traditionally and historically the planning process was never supposed to meet the needs of these specific communities. And so now, because of principles changing and value-based changes within cities, we are seeing this level of need within communities as well.
And Marie-Odile, maybe you could talk a little bit more about this idea of cultural mediation and how that engages vulnerable populations. And then maybe, Amina, you can give us some sort of concrete examples.
Well, mediation is really intended to create a dialogue between people with artists through culture, and so it's very it's a long process. It's not just one night where you explain an exhibit or a show. It's really a project that some citizens work with artists through a long process and reflect on many things through art. So it's really we say la rencontre entre l'art et le citoyen. So this is basically what it is, but it can be used in very different ways. And one of the ways that we're saying is really in the neighborhoods, which is different because we work on it and we how can I say in English? We work on the territory, how people see their neighborhoods, how they can imagine it in a few years, what are the places they like, how they use it. So very different things like that, but through arts, through mapping, but emotionally mapping with some artists. So very different projects like this in cultural mediation that engage them in their neighborhood. Yeah,
that's really incredible. I mean, so. I know that the WASC Center and the City of Vancouver has really been at the forefront of public dialogue. Can you just talk about some of the initiatives that you've been involved in, or that you would like to sort of explain how vulnerable communities are brought in?
Sure. So one that I can think of that would relate somewhat to work that's been done in Montreal as well. We have our own little Burgundy in Vancouver. It's called Hogan's Alley Society. And it was essentially it was a multiracial, multicultural community, but primarily where the African, Canadian or Black community was able to find housing within Vancouver. And so there were racial restrictive covenants put on land, restricting where people of Chinese descent, Afro-Canadian or Black descent or racialized as Black people could live in the city of Vancouver. And so all of these communities were congregated into one area, which today is known as the Northeast Falls Creek area. and it was essentially aligned with the railway and CP rails. And so you had the Black porters who could only find work on the railway. And so because you had racial restrictive covenants, the railways were connected to that neighborhood. And so they would find places to stay, live, eat in that specific neighborhood. Now, as a result of bringing it back to CMHC, urban renewal policies came into place. There was a term across North America actually called, that situated the concept of urban renewal as Negro removal, essentially. So it was mandated that these neighborhoods or areas where there was a congregation of the Black community were essentially stripped away through highway expansions and that sort of city development. And that's exactly what happened in the city of Vancouver. So when they were looking at expanding the highway, they expanded into the predominantly Black community and neighborhood, displacing them. Now, bringing that forward to 2018, there was the Northeast False Creek Plan that the city of Vancouver put together. And this was the first time that the plan actually took into consideration cultural dynamics, reconciliation, which is a big part of what we do in Vancouver. So I work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. These are the indigenous populations of that specific area. And Northeast Falls Creek housed the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. It was a huge sort of trading area and an actual village of sorts in that area before colonization. Then it was also home to Chinese residents who actually built the railway. So the railway has a big part in this story, and then the highway bulldozed through that. Northeast Falls Creek, what it did was it did deliberative planning and engaged the Black community through a committee formation, as well as the Chinese community, and as well as the urban indigenous and rights holders, which is what we call First Nations populations in British Columbia. And in this plan, it ended up winning an American Planning Association award for the level of engagement that they did with culturally specific groups under redress for the Black community and the Chinese community, and then also specifically with reconciliation work that was conducted with the indigenous population as well. So they embedded in, I also sit on the Hogan's Alley Society board, I'm a board director, and so we engaged specifically the city, and the city appointed a full-time staff member to sit in on the working group meetings, so essentially embedding city staff into sort of grassroots organizations so that they were sitting in and having to listen to the needs of the community, and then they embedded that into very specific terms within the Northeast Falls Creek Plan. And the agreement within that plan was cultural redress, a land trust, so tying development contributions over a period of time within that land designated area to the development of what would become a community land trust for the Hogan's Alley Society. In 2019, we also ended up receiving the ability to build temporary modular housing on that site. So now we have, it went from being a deliberative process, engaging the Black community, to now we actually have a concrete, affordable housing site in that area for seniors and urban indigenous and the Black population. And we also just signed a memorandum of understanding.
So I mean, that's a really impressive and fascinating, because I think it goes to a couple of the issues that Isabel identified at the outset. How do you institutionalize practices of inclusive deliberation, right? And how do you have follow-ups? How do you ensure that there's delivery after deliberation? So maybe, Marie-Odile, maybe you could talk a little bit about the emotional mapping and how that sort of connects with this idea of inclusion.
I have an example we did in Verdun, which was with kids. We were planning the neighborhood, and so we did a project of cultural mediation in a few classes, and we asked people, the young people, about how they could draw and imagine their neighborhood. So we did. The artist did a really book, and it was with de l'estampe, the stamping. Yeah. So they really worked for a few months, and then they reimagined the neighborhood, but with it's not quite emotional, but really what their dreams were. So there was camping near the river, and there's a lightning in the l'église, the church, and I don't remember all of them, but this was really how they loved their neighborhood, or things they hated, and so they mapped all of this, and the cultural team still uses that book and to inspire some of their planning now, because it tells something, even if it's very simple, of how they want to live in their neighborhood and how they want to use it, and also a lot of free spaces, how they want free spaces and security spaces a lot. So that tells us through the mapping with the stamps. That's a small example.
That's an amazing example. That's a really fascinating example, because I think, and we were speaking to people in the OCPM over lunch, and I think one of the challenges of an independent agency like the OCPM is, how do you have participation that is from groups that don't particularly work well in a standard kind of participatory process? Yeah, and so, that kind of work is incredible, because it gives you what people feel on the ground, and it's important information.
Yeah, the evaluation of these as documents that are drawings is difficult, though. It gives us a little bit of a headache how we use them, and then put this in an analysis to really document what people. That's complicated.
I guess you put it like in appendices to the report. Do you have any sort of examples of that kind of outreach, which is, because you're talking about how, I think everybody in the room understands that public hearings are really not great forums for inclusive deliberation and discussion. So do you have any sort of examples of kind of upstream outreach that has maybe not quite as funky as what Mario Odile does, but still, that engages people who do not feel comfortable in public hearing environments?
Yeah, and maybe I'll do a bit of a dialogue right now. I'm going to ask everybody in the room who has attended a public hearing or a public consultation. Okay. So good, a good amount. So usually when that question is asked, most hands are down. For people who aren't in the industry or people who do not engage in public consultation work, even bringing up the term public hearings is not something that people readily, intuitively understand what that even is. And so a big part of the work that we're currently doing right now is awareness raising, trying to get people to understand what's the difference between a land use public hearing and a court hearing, which are very different things. But right now, from what I understand, the processes of public hearing are also quite different between Montreal and Vancouver. We got a bit of a debrief from OCPM on how it works and the complexity in Montreal. The way that it works in Vancouver is essentially that, as I mentioned, a development application comes in, then it's reviewed, and the legislation is quite, allows for a level of variation between municipalities, as I mentioned earlier. And it can be very dry, an incredibly dry process, but different municipalities engage in different ways. The most interesting form of engagements I've actually found were deliberative processes. So the one that I mentioned, going outside of the box and embedding a city planner within a group. Also having citizens forums. So there was another plan that was conducted, which was the Grandview Woodlands plan, and that was done through citizens assemblies and forums. We're also working on a citizens assembly specifically on writing the official community plan for the city of Burnaby. So that's work that we're doing with the WAS Center right now.
Maybe explain a little bit citizens assembly.
Yeah, so the citizens assembly essentially selects a number of citizens essentially to sit in as a permanent assembly. And so they are the reviewing body and work very closely with the city on participatory engagement practices, and have much more of a direct say in what happens and what goes into that plan. versus the public hearing process, which is a notification process to a certain radius within a neighborhood. And what you end up having is those who have the time, who have free time, those who understand the process showing up, those who are able-bodied, those who don't have any other constraints. And so the Citizens Assembly actually allows for much more of an embedded process of citizens along the entirety of the plan development. So with the planning, the public hearing reform work that I'm leading, we're actually looking at hoping to get into more inventive ways of engaging. We've done a review in some of the work that we've already done and reviewed how the processes work across municipalities and across different countries as well. So we're really interested in what the City of Victoria in Australia is doing, for example. So they changed their Local Government Act not to have very strict, restrictive sort of rules on how you can engage the public in a public hearing. So again, that radius of who can attend a public hearing and whose interests are in relation to the public hearing. What the City of Victoria does is they've actually embedded a community engagement strategy with 5 principles. And it's essentially it's a principle-based engagement with that's embedded into the act. So it's legislated by right that city has to have an engagement policy or strategy. Right now, what we have in BC is different municipalities have different engagement strategies, and it's not mandated across the board. So one way to really, I think, be much more innovative and much more interesting in how to get folks out would be to have a public engagement strategy that thinks about culture, parks, all of these different dynamics, but engages much more creatively, maybe with street interventions or kitchen table talks are another way where you pay citizens and residents of specific neighborhoods to hold engagements and kitchen table talks in their apartments, working with tenants unions very closely on the needs of actual residents who are renters. And I could go on, but I'll let you get to the next question.
No, that's great. It's an amazing sort of range of possibilities. So I think related to this, so Marie-Odile, how do you build the kind of trust in the neighborhoods and with citizens so that they feel like they can actually have this kind of emotional engagement with you and your artists, given that, so I mean, the majority of the people here held up their hand when they said that they were, the only people who didn't were like the normal people, like the students. Everyone else sort of works in this area. So like all the normal people don't do this. So how do you engage normal people to kind of disclose this kind of emotional depth with you as they're talking about the places that they live and work?
Well, we have teams in every neighborhood, Maison de la Culture and libraries that work really close to the communities very much. We have a very social approach of culture. So these 2 networks of libraries and Maison de la Culture are a big part of how we are close to communities. And they have cultural mediators in their teams that work with the communities for years. And it's a long process. And they work with all les organismes communautaires, all in their neighborhoods and the schools and everything. So it's a long-term building process. So they are part of the neighborhood, and yeah, that's how we do it. Also, I don't know if you want to about how we work with the neighbors. Yeah. So I work with the central services, and I work with the 19 boroughs of Montreal, and we help them with funding to do their cultural planning and to work with the Maison de la Culture and libraries in the neighborhoods, and then we ask them to build cultural neighborhoods, like I said, and they are, it's very difficult to go from a plan to a culture, the vitality of a cultural neighborhood. There's a step that's missing, and that's what we created in the last few years. We do a shared governance laboratory. We do it to help them change their mind frame, not to just do a plan, think about the programming, but to really think about the territory and work with it. And at first place, we help them work with the other sectors. So with the urban planner and the communications sector and the economic development, the social development. So we put them together and we make them work together. So there's more transversality. Usually we use maps because it's very simple, but it's the best way. Everybody loses their plans and they look together at the map, and then they see all the same places they work on and the same communities they work with, and they can have a shared vision of what can be done in the neighborhood, and how culture can be close to all the other departments. Because we have difficulty. Is it working? No. Yeah, okay. We have difficulty working urban planning with culture. It's two separate worlds. It's two time frames, two different time frames. Urban planning is such a long-term planning, and in culture, it's very short-term. We work, for the next month, and we organize stuff, and it's it's difficult to work together, although we want to. But we do these laboratories to really help to make a synergy between all the sectors, and then when this is done, we help them to open up to all partners and citizens, because then there's more coherence. They work together. The process is more simple. It's not, the citizens don't talk to all different sectors, and the same for the organizations. It's a shared voice that works with the neighborhood. So that's what we try to do. And then when they open up to partners and citizens, that's when we put out cultural mediation projects, to work on the vision of the neighborhood, on the identity of the neighborhood with the citizens. Because sometimes the identity is planned with the urban planning projects, but at the end, it's different when it comes to the citizens. So we try to put it a bit earlier in the process. That's how we work, and we try to work. It's in the early stage, I would say, but it's very popular with the neighborhood.
That's amazing. And so I think this idea of a shared governance framework is so valuable, because I think one of the challenges of urban planning in general and just urban design is that there's a kind of gap between the identities that show up in something like an official plan or in a bylaw and what people live, le vécu. So I think there's this kind of gap, and I think that this kind of work really bridges that gap, and I think it makes the work of independent agencies like the OCPM a little bit more responsive to what people actually feel in their neighborhoods, and to understand that they are participants in the governance framework and not simply people that are consulted. They're actually co-producers. So, do you have any sort of examples of kind of shared governance frameworks in Vancouver? Oh, you're thinking so, no?
So I would say that's what we're trying to develop with the public hearing reform work. So a big part of the work that we're looking at is BC has been really progressive in terms of its reconciliation work. And so in BC, we also have quite a few urban indigenous or just indigenous nonprofit housing developers, and also for-profit housing developers. So very involved in how the city gets built in very tangible ways. And so within the reconciliation conversation for public hearings, one of the big questions that we have quite a few big questions. One of those questions is, when is a public hearing required? And rethinking that. Is a public hearing required? Our legislation comes from Western Europe, for the most part. Planning as we understand it comes from England, Germany, France, etc. Those are the big players that we've sort of taken what we've constructed here in Canada from. But Western Europe doesn't have public hearings the way British Columbia has it. They actually don't have the public hearing process in the way that we have imagined it here. So the level of democratization that we have here is a lot more advanced than in those countries that I've just named. So when we first brought this up, that we were looking to reform it, some of those locations, for example, in Britain, were like, no, don't do it. You're far more advanced in terms of that democratic process. But we engage in site-specific zoning, whereas they engage in policy-specific public hearings for that. So again, one of the things that we're looking at is legislative reform using human rights codes. So we actually haven't implemented the human rights legislation in any way with regards to the planning process. And so we're hoping to do that, especially with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. And we're engaging in a legal framework, essentially, for what does it mean for First Nations in British Columbia who are developing on their land, who are building housing to meet the needs of urban Indigenous populations, to then have to be accountable to a settler population on whether or not they can build. So that is a big question that we're interrogating right now, and the legal reform framework that we're engaging in, and the level of public engagement that's gonna occur through that using a reconciliation framework, and the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action as a tool are a big part of that. So I'll give you an example. There's a development with the MST, which is a development corporation from one of the Indigenous bodies, the Musqueam Squamish, and they're building a pretty large, sustainable, almost village on former Crown land, military land that was returned back to First Nations, and it's called Sinok. And there's this demand from the community nearby that they ought to have public hearings, even though they're somewhat exempt from that process. But services will be coming from the city of Vancouver. So there's all of these different competing complexities or wicked problems, as was mentioned earlier. And so that's what we're hoping to engage in the legal framework for. So I don't have a clear-cut answer, but that's what we're hoping to do is it's essentially engaging with two governments in a sense, and one being a rights holder with an Indigenous claim to land and unceded territory, and now development rights within BC.
That's really fascinating, and I wonder, along the same lines of a shared governance framework, I think for an agency like OCPM, there is this requirement of neutrality. That it's important in the work that this kind of agency does, but it's also a kind of it's something that allows the agency, I think, to have a kind of credibility with its stakeholders. And so, Marie-Odile, with your kind of deep engagement with the community, are you ever concerned that you're going to be viewed as not a neutral body, but rather a member or a partner in the specific concerns of the community? Is that concern about neutrality an issue for you?
Well, we are starting this, so these concerns are beginning to emerge, but don't have any answers. But yes, sure, we are. We want to open the city and change the how the city is with the communities and the citizens. So yes, it has its challenges. We don't want to be only the funding part or the regulatory part. We want to be part of the community of this shared governance. It is not. We're not a part of it. We are in it, and mainly because of the expertise of the teams that are really working a field work. So, but of course there are questions of des rapports de pouvoir.
Relationships of power.
Yeah, of course this is emerging, and we are thinking and dealing with it right now, but I don't have the answers. But of course it is important because and we try to have this inclusive role of because there's always big stakeholders in every neighborhood that really take all the place and will produce all the activities. And we try to do the middle ground and help the more smaller organizations to be part of this conversation. So that's the role we try to have, but it's a work in progress, I would say.
And I know that one of the things that the OCBM does really well is it has a great online presence. I wonder, I mean, like I know that the WASC Center has done really interesting sort of online work, and I wonder maybe if you could share some of the sort of consultation strategies that you have used in order to sort of do your outreach activities.
So we've actually got one coming up. We've had to move more into hybrid models or online models because of the pandemic, and I'm sure you all can relate to that. So we are engaging in a 2-day, essentially, Innovators Forum is what we're calling it. So part of the project is to have very specific demonstration projects. So we're at the end of actually implementing some of these engagements and processes across the province. So our work for the public hearing reform is actually across the province. So one of the things that we have to deal with is regional inequity. So how do you make reform at the legislative level that is going to work for a rural community in the same way that it's going to work for Vancouver, for example? And Vancouver also has a separate, legal framework, which is the Vancouver Charter, and all of the rural municipalities have to conform to the Local Government Act. So trying to bring people from across the province to Vancouver wouldn't work, and there's a lot of different ways that different communities feel about everything centered around the city of Vancouver as well. So we're gonna have the Innovators Forum, and it's actually going to be a way to bring in all sorts of different rights holders and stakeholders to deliberate and provide feedback on the types of demonstration projects they want to see occur. So we'll have planners, and we'll have architects, and we'll have members from tenants unions, and we'll have members from other nonprofit housing providers, et cetera. And it's going to be a dialogue-specific forum that we engage in. And so neutrality is actually a big part of our work at the Center for Dialogue as well. But we actually tackle some pretty political related topics. So reconciliation is political, that's not apolitical. Anti-racism is political, that's not apolitical. And so is any sort of housing deliberation to some extent is always going to be political. Who gets to live here, who doesn't get to live here, and all of the dynamics around why. So neutrality is an interesting one for us as well. Also climate change is political. So I think the Center for Dialogue has actually come to an understanding that there are very specific areas that we deal with in terms of public engagement that are political and are going to require that acknowledgement. But the dialogue component in this forum that we're going to be holding in March will be more so for us to facilitate a dialogue for all of these different groups to come together and share their ideas about what is working and what sort of demonstrations they want to see, acknowledge the political nature of the work, and facilitate the conversation so that our politics as the facilitators aren't sort of corrupting the process.
It's really fascinating because when Marie-Odile, you were talking about how what you try to do is that you act as a kind of counterweight to stakeholders who are the means, and that seems to me sort of there's a political aspect to it. And I wonder maybe also if you could talk about, so Amina was talking about sort of interregional inequities within British Columbia, but I imagine in the arts sector in Montreal, there are interregional inequities. I imagine that there are some neighborhoods which are very well endowed and have engaged populations, and others where they don't. So how do you as an organization sort of deal with those kinds of interregional, intercity inequities in the participatory process?
In the participatory process, I'm not sure, but we are working on what we call indice de la vitalité culturelle, because we call some désert culturel in the city, and so we
That's the
try
city of
to
that's the entire city of Toronto.
so we try to so we try to locate them and put more efforts on parts that are actually, but in terms of participatory projects, of course, we try to do more projects in these areas, but and work with organizations, but it's of course it's more difficult, and usually in these parts the city takes more place and organizes more activities. So yeah, and then it's more difficult to engage a shared governance because there's more inégalité in the I don't know how to say it in English.
Like, so there is a kind of inequality in the power relation. As a city coming in, you take up a certain amount of space within the conversation. I imagine it's also the same thing for the OCPM. Like, there are certain neighborhoods when the OCPM comes in, they're not building on the kind of we were speaking earlier about public hearings and how certain neighborhoods and certain communities have all the expertise they need to participate effectively, right? But in these kinds of environments, the city actually is playing a role in like a contrepoids, like a counterweight. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So I see that we're coming sort of towards the point in the conversation where we were going to open up the floor. Look at this, right on cue. So I think this might be a good moment. I think we have a sort of good overview of the work that our panelists are doing and the relevant stakes that they are addressing. And I think it might be a good opportunity to open the floor for conversation and question and answer. Évidemment, vous pouvez poser des questions dans la langue de votre choix. Et je pourrais faire une espèce de traduction simultanée.
Hi. Yeah, so the question would be for you. You talked about a lot about how Vancouver had a really progressive approach to public consultation and how it was really different in Montreal. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and give us some examples on how it's different between both cities.
So I got some more details about some of the differences between Montreal in an earlier conversation we had with OCPM. So one of the major differences is we don't have a separate entity that does our public engagement at the City of Vancouver, which I think is actually very progressive, to be honest, and just got to learn about some of the benefits and also some of the limitations. And so in the work that I'm leading with the public hearing reform, before even coming out here, one of the recommendations that we were looking at engaging in a demonstration on was how and if the city, or not the city, but different municipalities ought to contract out their public engagements. And then also another big question is, it seems as though the public engagement or the public consultation happens a lot earlier in Montreal, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it happens much earlier in the process, whereas the actual public hearing across different municipalities happens at the tail end. So what we end up seeing, especially for smaller nonprofit developers, so social housing development, all of this money is spent upfront, millions of dollars, and then it comes down to a public hearing process where those in a neighborhood who have the understanding, know how to navigate the system, can bring out a turnout and oppose that very badly needed housing, essentially are able to show up and manifest a situation where that nonprofit housing project is not moving forward. And so then you've lost all of this money. And so I brought up regional inequity. What we end up seeing then is a lot of affordable housing being congregated within very specific neighborhoods. And then that's an inequity in and of itself. And you don't have that dispersal of opportunities. So those in rural communities who need affordable housing don't have it because now it's a no-go zone for nonprofit developers, and that all comes down to that public hearing process. So one of the takeaways for us is the work that OCPM is engaging in. Another difference is we don't have a separate tribunal. So Toronto, it seems like here, there's a completely separate body of appointed individuals who aren't city councilors, who aren't the mayor, who actually oversee the different reviews for developments, whereas every single rezoning that takes place is site-specific, which is also one of the question marks that we have about whether or not all of these public hearings are required, but they are heard by City Council. And so those hearings, there have been hearings that have gone until 2 a.m. in the morning. So imagine city councilors, and the city councilors and mayor, well, mostly the city councilors, often have another job that they work at. And then during these public hearings, it can go until 2 a.m. And then imagine for citizens, who has until 2 a.m. to sit in there and wait to be heard at a city council meeting. So those are just some of the ways that they're different.
Merci. Hi. I guess the question's for all of you, but it is a comment about a couple of things that you said. The Office de Consultation of Montreal, this process is actually an exception to the rule. Most cities, within Montreal, you have a whole bunch of boroughs. Each of the boroughs run their own public consultations. Each of the merged cities run their own public consultations. And yes, I agree that there is a lack of neutral participation. I think personally there should be group mediators within those, someone neutral to actually run the public consultation, but there isn't. And there's a difference also in the process in Montreal in general, except for consultations that come to the Office de Consultation de Montréal, there's actually a freeze period. It's a unilateral freeze period where your councillors decree if they're going to change a bylaw, that they will hold public consultations. But you're actually missing most of the parties into that. You don't usually have all of the parties within the public consultation groups. And I'd like to know what you have to say about how the process happens in Vancouver. And the last question would be, how do they actually determine what will be the criteria to resolve, to approve or disapprove? Because I think that's one of the areas that's really lacking. I mean, how do you determine what weight to give to each element that's brought there? How do you get your people to actually confront their positions, the conflict management process, and actually determine what is best for the group as a whole and not necessarily for a small minimal group within that group? Thank you.
So I'll start with the second question because it's most fresh. So that is one of the identified problems in the public hearing process, is this sense of winners and losers, that even in showing up, that there's going to be a winner out of this process, and then that there's going to be a series of losers at the end of it. City Council deliberates, so it's quite different across the province. So some cities engage in their public hearing process where, I'll use the word combative, because people show up. It takes a lot of energy. People are very nervous. I have been doing this for over 10 years, and I've had to present at public hearings. I'm still nervous. And I've also been a resident at public hearings. I'm still nervous. I write everything down. So imagine for the lay person or the person who doesn't know how to navigate the system, showing up, and then in the combative process, having City Council essentially start interrogating them. So they start asking them questions about the legitimacy of them being at that hearing. So that's one way that some city councilors make a decision. You know, is this person articulate? Has this person made a good argument? You know, there's different rationales for how they decide. Or some of them go in, and they're not supposed to, with a biased way that they're probably going. And I mean, that's not supposed to happen, but let's be honest, we just talked about it being a political process. Other municipalities that I've seen do it is that it really is a hearing. Their role and staff's role is just to listen. So everyone shows up and they have a very specific time frame. So the city of Vancouver is 5 minutes that you get to talk, and then it's stopped. And then there's also the time limit perspective as well. The city of New Westminster did something really interesting. They used procedural bylaws. So every municipality has an ability to develop procedural bylaws. And I brought up human rights earlier. The way Euclidean planning works, and we discussed this earlier, so planning that is segregated by use, commercial only here, industry only here, and residential only in certain places, is essentially that individuals come and, the way Euclidean planning works is that it segregates uses, right? So if residents show up and they have 5 minutes to speak and they leave, they don't leave knowing what's going to happen with the time that they just spent. So what's the value per time or use there as well? They don't know whether or not it's going to be incorporated or how what they've presented is used. There's also a clerk associated with this, so there is a report at the end of it, but it also goes against this idea of procedural fairness, right? So council is supposed to make a decision afterwards, and then the report comes after the public hearing. So that could technically end up biasing their decision as well. So there's all these different procedural elements. So the city of New Westminster did a process where anytime language came up that was discriminatory, that seemed to speak, that was anti-poor, so that was class specific, or that was race-based in coded language, they used the procedural bylaw essentially to cut that time short. So that was one way to try to instigate a more fair process, but those who left having their time cut short felt as though they lost out from the process. So I hope that answers your question, but there is, because it's so varied, there's all sorts of different ways that council deliberates and decides how they're gonna vote. Yeah. So trying to ensure that it's not combative is a big part of the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much for that. I guess my broad question was about, you've mentioned the title of tonight's panel is Citizen Empowerment and Participation. So I guess when you look at public hearings or public participation, how much of a empowerment tool it is for citizens. So I understand from your answer that is yes, but type of. So let me focus maybe if you want. Et la question est aussi pour Marie-Odile sur la question des suivis relativement à ça. C'est vraiment intéressant, le laboratoire de la gouvernance partagée et la rétroaction aussi. Alors ça, j'aimerais bien vous entendre sur un exemple précis sur ça. Je pense qu'on a beaucoup à tirer. Amina, if you could talk about some you've mentioned those 5 minutes and they're gone, sort of. So what type of accountability processes could you share with us in terms of, I know that it's something very, that elected members at the municipal level are always, do not deal with or do want to look at necessarily. Le CPM has not the mandate to do follow-up. So what if you could share some examples in terms of accountability following public hearing, that would be wonderful.
So, Marie-Odile?
Yes. Do I answer in French or in Je vais le faire en français. Peut-être juste commencer par dire que par les projets qu'on fait de médiation culturelle, c'est un peu un safe space pour travailler avec les citoyens sur des enjeux de façon plus simple, de laisser une place pour les exprimer de façon différente. Puis finalement, en les récoltant, de peut-être avoir un impact quand même sur la ville, de pouvoir s'exprimer sur la ville et d'avoir un certain impact, mais c'est sûr que c'est à très petite échelle. Et la difficulté que je mentionnais tantôt, c'est peut-être la traduction des enjeux vers des projets culturels où on veut traiter de certaines réflexions, et la traduction après de ce qu'on récolte de ces projets-là pour vraiment en faire. Après, c'est sûr que, comme je le dis, c'est un safe space, ben, il y a beaucoup d'enjeux éthiques sur lesquels on travaille avec la médiation culturelle, justement, comment on travaille avec les communautés vulnérables et tout ça, et comment on les utilise pas juste pour un projet, on travaille avec eux à long terme. Donc ça, j'ai pas de réponse précise, mais c'est vraiment quelque chose à laquelle on réfléchit. Toute la question de la rémunération aussi vient en ligne de compte quand ils contribuent vraiment à des projets, jusqu'à où c'est un projet de loisir ou de médiation, et après ça devient une contribution à un projet de la ville. La ligne parfois est mince. Ça, c'est tous des enjeux sur lesquels on réfléchit, mais c'est sûr que le suivi se fait à travers les équipes locales. Donc, avec des partenariats vraiment qu'on essaie de construire de façon plus permanente avec les organismes, avec les citoyens. Là, c'est sûr que c'est un peu plus difficile, c'est directement à travers les partenariats. Mais je dirais que aussi, toute la question des laboratoires de gouvernance partagée, on est vraiment au début. On est vraiment dans la partie où est-ce qu'on travaille simplement avec les arrondissements pour vraiment leur faire changer de posture. On n'a pas fait beaucoup d'arrondissements où est-ce qu'on travaillait avec les citoyens, Verdun un peu, Saint-Laurent qui a commencé. Donc, c'est encore en réflexion. On a des communautés de pratique entre les arrondissements pour justement discuter de tous ces enjeux-là, puis d'essayer de voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut en retirer, puis comment on peut encore plus améliorer, puis faire le suivi justement avec les citoyens qu'on implique là, dans le projet. Mais bon, pour l'instant, on travaille vraiment plus avec les arrondissements. Le changement de posture, la transversalité, plus de cohérence, vraiment essayer de mutualiser les projets, de travailler ensemble de cette façon-là, puis de voir ensemble comment on peut avoir plus d'impact pour les citoyens. Donc, on est dans cette étape-là, je dirais, beaucoup plus que dans celle avec... c'est pas encore, on n'est pas rendu encore à la gouvernance partagée totalement. C'est un gros bateau à faire bouger. Et la ville, c'est ça le défi, là, mais avec des petits projets, des laboratoires, c'est comme ça qu'on amène un petit peu plus d'innovation dans la grosse machine ville. Donc voilà.
So, I mean, I think the fact that the partnership and the laboratory is sort of at its early stages, it's sort of difficult to see the long-term impacts and follow-ups for citizens. And, you know, you raise really important kind of ethical issues about how to engage with citizens, especially around issues like remuneration for participation. I mean, these are really deep questions. And, you know, the challenge of translating the stakes of a given project, both to the citizens and back to the city itself. I think these are sort of perennial problems of participation and governance. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how Vancouver addresses these kinds of questions, and in particular the questions of accountability and follow-up.
Sure. So I'll speak first about the center. So the center produced a document called Beyond Inclusion, and so that came out of our knowledge and practice team, and it's got 8 principles on how to engage equitably within public engagement processes, and remuneration is a big part of that, asking people to come in and share their time. Let's make sure we pay people for that. What we do see with the city of Vancouver specifically, and even across the province, is again, that variation in how municipalities do it. The city of Vancouver has essentially advisory committees that are appointed. So I sit on the Vancouver City Planning Commission. That is a commission essentially that has representatives from the planning department, the parks board, and so they're accountable to the citizen-appointed board on the Vancouver City Planning Commission to share what's happening with us, and then we provide feedback. So that's one point of public consultation with residents or citizens of the community. And so we at the commission as well can put forward motions that we'd like to see City Council take into account. So one motion that I can speak to was we had a heat dome quite a few years ago, a heat wave. It wasn't a heat wave, but it was a heat dome, and quite a substantial number of people died in the city of Vancouver from heat-related issues. And so what the city commission did, the Vancouver City Planning Commission, we put forward recommendations as a commission, as a citizens board, on what the city of Vancouver would need to do to ensure that something like that never happens. And we considered sustainability measures, equity points, and one of the biggest ways that we held the city accountable was through that specific motion. And what we did see was the city updated its building bylaws specifically to include air conditioning as an equity point, specifically in new builds. So all new builds, it's supposed to start 2024, are supposed to have air conditioning units in them. It doesn't have older buildings that require updating. So that's another element that the Vancouver City Planning Commission wants to follow up with. But that's one way that the city was receptive to the motion that was put forward. Another element that was in the motion was ensuring alerts go out. British Columbia, I don't know if Quebec has emergency alerts for climate-related emergencies. We didn't have that until after this. So there was no alert that went out to citizens about this, the crisis with the heat wave. And within that motion, we indicated that we needed those alerts to go out in multiple languages, as there are migrants, there are newcomers, there are individuals who English is not the first language for them, and communication from the city of Vancouver needs to be in more than one language. So that's one way. Public engagement strategies also have what we heard documents. So it depends on the municipality, but they will develop essentially documents and then put it on the website. And it breaks down precisely what was heard at the public hearing. And the best municipalities will address exactly how they're going to be implementing some of those changes. So implementation is one of the biggest issues, and I'm sure it's the same for OCPM, where recommendations go through, and then afterwards, you know, these things can end up sitting on shelves. So really it takes the advocacy of citizen groups and then council-appointed advisory bodies and things of that nature to put that pressure back on the city to ensure that they're implementing some of these recommendations that come out.
So I see that it's 7 o'clock, and I notice that there's still wine. So I thought this might be a good moment to finish the event and to thank. Alors, je tiens à remercier le CPM pour toute l'organisation ainsi que l'accueil chaleureux qui nous a été offert. Alors, and thanks so much for Kriyam and my colleagues for all of the work that they've done, including for social media outreach and for publicizing the event. So thank you all for your questions and for your participation, ironically. And I hope we can continue the conversation over wine. Thank you.
Thank you.